Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we're going to dive into a couple videos from Gary Vee. He talks about how 98% of the brands you love will collapse. We'll also talk about how to dominate the cannabis industry, according to Gary Vee, and then wrap up with the future of the cannabis industry, an interview with Dope Magazine. On the line with us is Dan Chemist, our CBD correspondent with Good CBD Products. So I've made some inflammatory statements, some hyperbole, but things that I still believe that cannabis doesn't really have brands, and that it's going to take a while for people to stop asking about the highest THC with the lowest price. Instead, people are starting to come in because they know what they want. They're asking for brands now. And that's simply because it meets their needs, not because that brand has something that is special or great. It's simply because it's probably within their price range. And so Gary Vee kind of goes into a video about how 98% of those brands will collapse. And so I want to talk about those 4 points. I kind of go back and forth. I agree and disagree with some of the things he said. I think he's spot on with this one for 4 reasons that I pointed out. The first being that the overpriced media has created too large of a customer acquisition cost, or CAC, at around 30, I think Gary Vee said $33, with an LTV or lifetime value budget of only $19. So what that means is people will have a budget to go out and gain a customer at the price of 19, but they're spending 33. And that's simply because there's so much capital being thrown around right now that companies are literally wasting 50% more than they need to, simply because they can.
The cost acquisition of a client for something that might just disappear or is not all that memorable, that's expensive business.
So Gary Vee's theory is that when the market corrects or there's a recession, that these companies will no longer be able to pay that $30 or $33 CAC, customer acquisition costs. Instead, they'll have to probably go out of business because they can't afford that $19. The second point Gary Vee makes is that social media influencers are underpriced. We just had a video not too long ago on the Talking Hedge podcast about how maybe social media influencers have a bubble and that they're not as effective. And that came across where 2.6 million followers weren't willing to buy 36 t-shirts from a particular social media influencer, which prompted the question, are they efficient? Is there a bubble? Gary Vee says that they play a huge role. Influencers by nature are creative and distribution media, all in the price of one, with affirmation, word of mouth, and cosigning. So they're a great deal within the industry. I think there's maybe a role to play because of alternative media. I think there are some social media influencers that could be efficient. I just think that there's too many of them and you need to do your homework.
We're at a post-influencer age, Chronic. Again, that whole thing where, find the trusted voice, recognize that in a post-influencer age, it isn't about having 50,000 or 250,000 friends. It's about having like 500 of the right friends.
Gary Vee's number 3 point on why 98% of the brands you love will collapse is the inability for modern media to suffocate their channels in order to find the key return on investments. So this goes back to point 1, where the overpriced media has created a customer acquisition cost of $30. They're willing to spend so much money because capital is just floating around everywhere. Gary Vee will actually only use one form of media, like billboards, he said. With his partnership with K-Swiss Shoes, he only used billboards just to find out how many people he would sell to with one form of media. And so 98% of the brands will collapse because they don't know what their key ROIs are, and they're not willing to suffocate the channels in order to find them.
Big time, right? Again, you're in a rush to make sales. So you put some money into this account, you throw some money over there, you go buy a magazine ad, you make a podcast, you do, 19 things. And then you see some sales, but you don't know which of them actually brought the sales. And if you can't do A/B testing, if you can't isolate down to a specific column, how do you know what to fund?
And the final point that Gary Vee makes about why 98% of the brands you love will collapse is that brands are simply wasting 85 to 90% of their marketing budget doing old things with old reports. So that's just a lot of validation for us at the Talking Hedge to provide current data that's accessible, that's absorbable, that you can do something with and explain without wasting a lot of money. It's for valuation, it's spot on. Instead, with all the capital running around, people are literally only getting 10 to 15% of the value, whereas we like to offer at least 100%.
Or as you like to tell me, turn it up to 101. I like that.
So Gary Vee says how he thinks cannabis industry can be dominated, can be broken down into four main points. One, what he says is he said be in cannabis for cannabis. I think you kind of made that point a couple of times that people that for tech, I'm going to make the analogy that Gary Vee had made, that when he saw people jump into tech, it was because they loved tech. They were just straight up nerds. The people that are in cannabis have a medicinal background. They're philanthropic. They want to help people. And so the backbone of it is to be in cannabis for cannabis. And I think we have a lot of that with a lot of the founders.
No doubt. I'm not sure I agree that that's a key to dominating, but Gary Vee says so, so I'm willing to, how should we say, consider it.
Noted. The second point is to build content. Kind of goes along with the Talking Hedge, trying to dominate the cannabis business industry one word at a time, and that's to build content. Gary says a lot of controversial things. One is that doesn't matter about quality as long as it's getting better, just put it out there. So if you're a makeup artist and you look like a clown, that's actually going to be some pretty entertaining material down the road when you're famous.
As somebody who likes to make a lot of content, I can't say, I disagree, because it goes like this. Make it, keep making it, do what you do with like the Talking Hedge, right? Every day, right? Every day, make something. Put some content out there, put good data out there, see what comes. We got a line of folk. It's pretty neat.
It obviously needs to be relevant. Content needs to be current, but in terms of quality, he gets into perfectionism in the next video. That's part 3. And so the number 3 point to dominate the cannabis industry, according to Gary Vee, is to stop crying about not being able to do things, about not having banking or not having advertising capabilities on Instagram and Facebook. Just find an alternative, be an entrepreneur, and just do it.
Yeah, well, who likes to listen to people whine all the time?
Right. I mean, you need to be, an entrepreneur, somebody that's going to be driven and focused and find solutions. And you can't just sit around Facebook and complain about it, right? You have to just make some content, find a solution, make the content, and then get additional followers with that. Because if you're in cannabis for cannabis, then you're going to have that passion anyways. Which leads us to the fourth point on how to dominate the cannabis industry is to be comfortable working within a highly regulated industry. There's going to be a lot of volatility, a lot of changes, which gives you a lot of opportunity for content, and also maybe a lot of chances to not cry and complain about the lack of fairness on platforms like Instagram or even banking.
As a journalist and as a field researcher, one of the things that's always interesting is chaos equals good story, right? Chaos equals the opportunity to get out your camera or your microphone and go to work. And that's one of the things that makes the cannabis industry so rich with regards to the field work you have me doing. Everywhere I go, there are gripping stories, and then harnessing those, turning those into content and delivering with those. Again, people love a good story, brother. And there's lots of good stories in the cannabis industry.
Right. And the cannabis industry is not going to be any less regulated anytime soon. So just get comfortable with it. And it requires people, boots on the ground, to give you that data, as well as professionals to keep you in line for compliance, for analytics, for operations, you name it. So the future of the cannabis industry, an interview with Dope Magazine with Gary Vee. So there's a few points that I want to make, a half a dozen to be exact. And number one is that the cannabis industry is ahead of every other industry because of its youth and entrepreneurship. This is according to Gary Vee when interviewing Dope Magazine about 6 months ago, saying that just the drive and the tenacity of the industry, it's youthful, it's energetic, there's a lot of entrepreneurs. Maybe that's good, Maybe that leads to a lot of learning opportunities. What do you think, Dan?
I'm a fan of a blended team. As far as I'm concerned, one of the greatest resources you can have in your hands is that young, bright-eyed, she wants to lead, she's got some vision, or he's got some vision and all of that. And at the same time, I also do think that there's a place for some seasoning and some jaded old hands, because yes, cannabis is interesting and fun and fresh, but it's business, and business has a lot of, hard old rules in it.
So the number 2 point for the future of the cannabis industry is that the cannabis industry is going to be the teacher of innovation by 2040, influencing how all products are sold. So Gary Vee thinks that by 2040, that people that are in the industry now are going to be teachers of innovation to diaper companies and tire companies, and that what we're learning now is going to be transferable across all product lines within the next 20 years.
Hey, Kron, again, I hate to dissent, but let's dissent for just a little bit. So much of this knowledge is so transitory. It doesn't age well, right? And by 2040, brother, I'm going to be dead. So the whole thing of like, hey, that might be true, but suffice it to say, I'm more interested in 2025.
Well, in the near term, you can make more content, be less subjective, recognize that your ego is the reason for your perfectionism. Otherwise, you'll become obsolete. I think that's an interesting quote that he made during this interview. Gary Vee kind of said that making more content is the key difference. To be less subjective, to recognize that your ego is a creation of perfectionism, and harnessing that will force you to become obsolete.
The internet already has lots of below average content. So if you make average content or better, you're doing just fine.
Well, I'd say we're doing pretty well then, which leads us to number 4, focus on podcasting. It's very, very real. So real, he had to say it twice. So I think we're doing a pretty good job just giving good current content. I think production and everything else could be a little bit better, but it's Kaizen, which is a Japanese philosophy of constant improvement for the better. We're putting out content every day, trying to get better as we get going. We're focusing on cannabis business. And so everything else that comes with it, the software, hardware, we're just learning as we go. But I would agree it is very, very real.
Well, this is the thing with regards to the work you're doing, okay? Here's the deal. Sure, there's some rough edges, no doubt. And certainly there are things that we can do better. But in the end, it's about the data. And if the data's real and the data's in there, then the fact of the matter is the cast has met its mission, in that ultimately that is what the Talking Hedge is about. And so again, do you need a pretty logo flying around on a screen? No, not really. You need more data.
Bad data in is bad data out, as we say. And I think if you utilize inefficient social media influencers, you're going to get the same bad results, which leads us to the next point that Gary Vee said is the future of the cannabis industry, which is to utilize social media influencers. We've talked about on the podcast a couple of times about the social media influencer bubble, on how everybody thinks that if they can just get followers, then that'll translate into dollars. And that does not make sense. You need to find somebody who can, like Gary Vee, who can bring in followers and actually translate that into dollars, where he can sell his shoes that he's partnered with K-Swiss, for example. Whereas in other situations we've seen with social media influencers who have $2.6 million and can't sell 36 t-shirts, well, what's the point? And so with Gary Vee, utilizing social media influencers, I think needs a caveat, which is to make sure that you have key performance indicators that you're following to make sure that the dollars you're spending on those social media influencers actually results in the results you want, which should probably be revenue.
Some numbers. If you're not familiar with the social media influencer game, it goes like this. So for instance, a typical Instagram influencer might make $500 on 1,000 likes if they're like we'll say a high-end model. There's a threshold required with regards to what are the costs of a sustainable campaign. Know what you're buying, really, right? That's the thing, is know what you're buying and make sure that it's actually doing what they told you they would.
And the final point that Gary Vee makes for the future of the cannabis industry, for the future, the sixth and final point is that Gary believes that cannabis delivery methods and hardware packaging designs will be the future of the cannabis industry. So different vaporizers, different delivery methods, as well as the packaging and hardware design are going to be the focus in the future. I tend to agree with them when you see Wick and Mortar charging $50,000 for a brand logo and the design, as well as a lot of the hardware that's coming out. There's hasn't been the capital behind that for the innovation. And now that we're seeing it, I think there's going to be a massive amount of new products coming online that we may see this December at MJ BizCon in Vegas, and possibly with that other delivery methods.
You want to dominate, either lock up a big chunk of the commodities and go play the futures game, or go make a cool new tidbit that nobody else can duplicate because it's your own widget and it gets people, and it's useful in the market. That's a way to dominate.
Yes, it's a great opportunity to differentiate. There's a company here locally in Washington called Green Revolution, and they're working with an Israeli-based tech company called Raya. I met them in Vegas last year, and they have a accurate dosing meter, and it works with Bluetooth on your phone. And so it can read the cannabis that is burning and send all that information and tell you what your optimum inhale time is. So if you want 5 milligrams, it'll tell you that after 15 seconds, it'll just stop the machine. It'll tell you the terpene profile. There's a lot of software opportunities with it. It's a little chunky in terms of size, but I think that the software and the data that it's going to provide is phenomenal. So there's some pretty cool opportunities for delivery methods, accurate dosing, hardware, all of those things that are really kind of driving some of the investment vehicles, along with data being the second largest investment vehicle this year in the cannabis space specifically. So that could be the future of cannabis with cannabis delivery methods and hardware and packaging design. But you're going to have to tune back into the Talking Hedge to find out. So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is the Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't. And I'm out.